Hello, my name's John
Hi.
Herd. I'm the Director of Research Through People. And today we're going to talk to Jon Herd, who had ancestors in both England and Scotland. and some very interesting twists and turns in that. And we're going to discuss my research with him. So, John, why don't you tell people a little about yourself?
Well, I'm Jon Herd. I'm a native of Ayr. That was an accident of birth, like a lot of people where I was brought up. My father moved to Ayr from Stirling when I was 2 weeks old for work, and I'd say I'm a native of Ayr. Although I currently live in Kilmarnock, I'm actually from Ayr, so that's a good start. And I'm now retired and looking into my family tree.
That's good. And we're going to look at going back. And one interesting question always is, to what extent may your ancestors have affected you and your life and your career, etc. So I put together some sort of slides. I can put them up and we can chat to them as we go on. So I will share screen. And where did your ancestors come from? And your father's side, the Herds, came from Fife. But you've asked me to look at your mother's side, the MacMillans, and grandmother's Oakley. So the MacMillans were from Fort William,
Yes.
and then they came south and ended up in Glasgow.
Yeah.
You came down south. What's interesting, the Oakleys were from around London, so we've got quite a big divide there, etc. But what we're going to do is look in more detail here and zoom in, but it's always useful to keep a picture of where people are from. So the ancestry, so your mother, Jennie, she was actually born in London,
Yes.
Silvertown, and she marries Ian Herd, and the Herds are from Fife, as we've said. And then her father, John, he's from Govan in Glasgow, married in West Ham, down in Essex, just near London, because your grandmother, Jennie, was born in Mile End in London. So I'll say a little bit about the places here, because it's useful to get a context, particularly, I don't know how well you know London and so on, but London's got many different variations.
Yeah.
But going back to the MacMillans, they came from Rothesay down to Govan. Before that, they were in Lanarkshire, in Glasgow. And as I said, they originally came from Fort William. And what was very interesting, the Industrial Revolution almost always has an effect on people. And so they've left the original place and come and moved. And Govan was very much a growth area for shipbuilding and various other things. Mary Mitchell is from Inverness, another place. Then on the Carmichael side, Maggie's born in Partick. And in fact, her parents are also born there. Now, what's interesting, the Chapmans were from Kinghorn in Fife. And I think you said you had a loving cup passed down from the Chapmans.
That's right. That came from my mother, who got it from her ancestors, I would assume. And the connection there was always rather vague. It was always rather vague to my mother as well as to exactly who the Chapmans were. And sadly, my mother's no longer with us and unable to find out, as I have done, who the Chapmans were and what that means to the family. It's a beautiful loving cup. It's a good age as well, and I'll be looking after it.
Well, that's good. In fact, it was Agnes's father, John, who you had details of. And what's interesting is, in fact, the MacMillan, John MacMillan, or in fact his mum, when he was growing up, they moved to Kinghorn.
Yeah.
And in fact, when they came back from London in the Second World War, they went to Kinghorn.
Yes.
We'll look at that in a bit. So there's an interesting connection there. On the Oakley side, so Alfred from Enfield, just to the north of London, Mary Bow, Middlesex, and we'll talk about this because London just meant the city of London right up to the end of the 19th century, and Middlesex went right up to the edge, and we'll talk about that. And then they're going back to Edmonton. Now,
Yes.
Susan Trundle, you can see from Hertfordshire. Now, I don't think I've told you this before, but Mary Newman's parents, William, came from Hertfordshire, but you've got a bit of Yorkshire blood in you.
Oh, really?
Amelia Wilkinson is from Leeds, or was from Leeds.
Goodness me. Yeah, okay.
So, any comments on that?
Well, I think you asked if there was any surprises, and certainly there has been some surprises. there's a tiny village in called, I think it's called Broffing, Braughinge, that features. And my mother always said to me that there was a Much Haddam connection. She was adamant about this Much Haddam connection.
Much Haddam,
Yeah, the two villages are quite close together, and in fact, Much Haddam is mentioned in her family tree, so she was right.
And so, which county is that in? You know,
Northamptonshire, I think.
Oh, right.
No, it's. I need to look it up. It's not. It's a bit north of Enfield.
Interesting. I wonder if it came down from there.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's look in a bit more detail. And one thing that's always interesting is to see that the occupations people have. And you've got quite a strong sort of Navy Sea connection, I believe.
Indeed, yes. I was brought up with naval folklore, if you like. We have a lot of stuff in the house. In fact, casting my eyes about the room here, I can see several artifacts that my grandfather brought back from the sea, either bits of ships or stuff that he'd bought in his travels around the world.
This is John MacMillan, yeah?
This is John MacMillan. Yeah, John MacMillan. But his ancestors too were seafarers. I note with great interest. And early MacMillan was in the Royal Navy, and his conduct was described as good, but he was given he was locked up for assaulting an officer.
Right.
So interesting stuff. But yes, I suppose it's very cliche to say I have the sea in my blood.
It's always interesting what family stories there are, because if you like, I do the research to the records and so on, but it can always be added to with stories and stories that are passed down very often. But it's quite interesting that there's John MacMillan, a steamboat agent.
Yes.
And then John MacMillan, son, becomes a ship plater, obviously working in Govan. And then John MacMillan, marine engineer. And well, you know a bit more about that. So let's look at this in a bit more detail. We'll take the MacMillans first. And they end up in Glasgow. Now, Glasgow's a remarkable story. Take 1700, between that and 1900, those 200 years, its population increased by 50 times.
Yeah.
It was just a small, almost village town in the north, where Glasgow is now, we would think, but Govan and places like that were just green fields. And yet with the Industrial Revolution, they talk about the second city of empire. So explosion of jobs, the shipbuilding and various other things and so on. And it's interesting, I plotted here where your family lived in and around Glasgow. And it wasn't just one place. You can see there's Govan and Partick.
Oh, yeah.
There's Kinning Park, Tradeston, Hutchison Town, Anderson. I don't know if you've been to any of the places where they live, but it's always interesting if the house is still there to actually be able to go and see where your ancestors lived.
I've had a look on Google Earth is a very good resource. If there's an address or a street, and there often is, I go into Google Earth, but frankly amazed at the changes there have been over those years. I mean, there's hardly anything left. There's hardly any of the family homes still standing. There's a couple in London, one in Hornchurch on the other side, but really in Glasgow, certainly pretty much all gone.
Yeah, of course, that's one of the things that happens, unfortunately. The churches are normally still there, but no, it's a matter of chance. But if they are there, it can be a lovely thing. So, family members lived in a lot of different parts of Glasgow. And one of the areas was Helen Street in Govan.
Yes.
So the MacMillans came down from Rothesay to Govan, quite an interesting move in the 1880s. And son John, as we was a ship plater. He moved to Helen Street. Now, what's interesting, in fact, his wife Maggie Carmichael, her parents, Carmichael married the Chapmans we were talking about. They actually lived, and they lived the same address, and there were 4 different generations, because John Chapman, as it was still alive, aged 90.
Yes.
He was the one who passed down the loving cup.
Yes.
And he's living with his daughter. Her daughter, married to John MacMillan, moves in, and they've got children. So there's actually 4 generations living together. Pretty unusual. Yeah. But you could see a mixture of industrial area and obviously housing, etc., just south of the River Clyde.
Indeed, yeah, very interesting. I know that area quite well.
You do? Yeah. So that's a little bit about the MacMillans. So the Oakleys of London. So again, in a similar way, I think it's useful. London again was a pretty amazing story. In the 1800s in particular, the Industrial Revolution gets going early 18th century, but doesn't really pick up big momentum until the 19th century. So London's population went from 1 million to 7 million to become the biggest city in the world. The Thames clearly was a big factor. The City of London, just on the North Shore, well, that was London for a long time. And in fact, if we look at the map, here's the City of London, sometimes called the Square Mile, you may know. And you can see here is the outline of what was, or still is, the City of London. But right up to the end of the 19th century, that's what London was. And your ancestors lived in the East End of London, but it was still Middlesex.
Yes.
And you'll see, in fact, some of the records, it says Poplar in Middlesex, and then it says Poplar in London, because they eventually changed the registration areas to fit in with that. But places that, say, tourists would come to in London, Buckingham Palace, Big Ben, are outside the original London. Your ancestors were in Enfield and Edmonton, just to the north.
Yes. And
then they moved to Bow and Poplar. And it's quite helpful, I find, to look at the parishes, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But here's Enfield and Edmonton. You mentioned Google Earth. So here's a Google Earth map. Enfield's just to the north of Edmonton. And so they lived in Baker Street. And Sherlock Holmes was here at the time. Not the same street, but they're living there. And in 1851, there's Joseph and two of his sons, and they're all agricultural labourers, in other words, farm workers. And that was a farm then, a built-up area now. Anyway, where Conical Centre Corner comes from. And then Alfred was born in Edmonton, just to the south. This is, are you an Adele fan? This is where Adele, the singer, comes from. So you come from Tottenham, just to the south of this. In fact, you see here Lee Valley. She's got a song about the River Lee.
The
background. And so here are the parishes in London. So back to our map, River Thames, City of London, and so on. So your ancestors were from Bow and Poplar. Bow, Bromley, and Poplar parishes were in the district of Poplar. So if they're born in Bow, the record will say Poplar, and also in Mile End. So let's look at, here are the Oakleys in Bow from the 1870s. So this is towards the end of the 19th century. Victoria Park is the second biggest park in London after Hyde Park. And to get a feel for them living there, strange name is Old Ford, and I suspect it comes from just that. There was an old ford there, and a canal and so on. And they lived on St Stephen's Road. Literally, about 2 years after they married, they moved to St Stephen's Road. They lived on three different houses in St Stephen's Road, and they both died there. 50 plus years, so the family grew up there. Their son Alfred went to Atley Road School. Over here. Daughter Jennie, your grandmother, went to school on Roman Road. Again, interesting names, isn't it? That's connection to the past. And they married in St Paul's Church. Naturally, it was a local church. Any comments on that? Have you been down to London and seen? Or?
I haven't. I know that last time I was in London, I didn't have all this information. I know that Brixham Road, which my mother lived in, was bombed out and destroyed. I know where the area is in London, so it's a sort of remote familiarity with it. But yeah, this has turned up some interesting information, particularly around the Edmonton workhouse, that young Sarah gave birth and looked after her baby in the workhouse. I didn't know I had any relations in the workhouse. And I have another relation marked as a pauper, which must have been a terrible thing. They were all labourers, I suppose, but to be marked as a pauper would have been slightly different. So perhaps they came up in the world by the 1870s.
Yeah, I mean, the world was so different then in so many ways. There was no um, benefits and all the rest of it, and welfare state and so on. And yeah, if you hadn't got much money, the church did quite a lot to help. But by and large, you went into these workhouses or poorhouses,
Yeah.
and they were doing their best to start off with, but no, not easy. What's intriguing, John, for me is I have ancestors from Enfield,
Yeah.
Edmonton,
Uh-huh.
and from just to the north of Victoria Park.
Right.
And as you were saying, the Second World War, a lot of bombing. So housing that my ancestors lived in have also disappeared.
Yeah.
But to me, I personally find this so interesting, learning more about the past, the way things were, and the way people had to cope
Yeah.
with poverty or whatever. I mean,
Uh-huh.
clearly the opportunities for women were very limited. They weren't that great for men either. You mentioned your ancestors being agricultural laborers,
Yes.
farm workers. That was the most common job in the 1841 census.
Mhm.
People lived in the country, worked on the farms. And then with the Industrial Revolution, they gradually came to the places where the work was. And that's why London expanded so much.
Yeah.
So, do you know the significance of Bow in terms of the language in London?
Yes. I'm not sure how factual this is, but my grandmother, Jennie, always insisted she was born within the sound of Bow Bell.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And I think she was probably right. I'm not that clear on the geography, but when I was very young, to my ears, she sounded like the Queen. She had a very posh
Did she?
accent. When she wanted to, she could put on the Cockney, real East End accent, and it was absolutely hilarious. Because that's probably what she grew up with.
Yeah, is he? I mean, Cockney. So Cockney is what the East End of London speak, and rhyming slang.
Oh yeah,
And it's only when I talk to sort of people from other countries that they're surprised by that. One thing I find interesting because I've moved from London from Kent to Scotland, and I think Glasgow humour is very similar to Cockney humour, but their accents are so different.
yeah,
I'm not sure they
indeed.
can understand each other very well.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
Right, so they lived there, and then
Yep.
eventually the Jennie meets John MacMillan, and
Yes.
he's obviously down in London, and in fact they stayed in London until the Second World War when they
Yeah.
went back up, and then in fact, as I said, they actually moved from Glasgow to Kinghorn in Fife.
Yes. Yep.
One other thing to throw in, you mentioned the wars. One thing I found was this is, in fact, not your direct descendant, but Alfred Oakley. First World War starts, and he joined the Northumberland Fusiliers, and
Yes.
here's the start of his record. And the
Yep.
records, if the records have survived, they've got a lot of information. Now,
Uh-huh.
what's ironic in the Second World, I'm sorry, let's go back. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. In the Second World War, the Germans
Mhm.
bombed the building where where the records were, and some of them got destroyed. There's what's called the burnt records. So there were
Mhm.
fires, and so part of the records have survived, and then others are in good shape, as
Yeah.
the case here. Now you can
Indeed.
see, are you a British subject? What is your age? 19 years, 1 month.
Uh-huh.
And he was born in 1898. So if you
Right.
do maths, he was
Uh-huh.
age 16. And I'm
Yes.
sure you've heard a lot of people lied about their age.
Indeed.
They thought the war would be over very quickly and so on.
Yeah.
Now, one of
Uh-huh.
the things you get in the record is the person's height,
Uh-huh.
at 5.5 inches. Um, it has a record of where he did service, so he served in France and Salonika. And when he left, he got this report, very intelligent, a very good groom.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yes. My mother spoke about her uncles, in fact, Alfred and George. although George doesn't feature as such in this. So I'm not sure what happened to George Oakley, but yeah, Alfred's story is very interesting, the military connection there and the standard of the records. Yeah.
Ah. So good. So anything else you'd like to say?
No, I mean, just that my mother was very unlucky in terms of her choice of house. She was bombed out of Brixton Road. They moved to Clarence Drive in Glasgow and were hit in the Clydebank blitz and were bombed out of there.
Is that right?
And yeah, and ended up in Kinghorn. So the Nazis chased them around the country. My grandfather, her father, made a very good living as a chief engineer with BI. That was a big company at the time. And the house that they had in Kinghorn is a big and substantial house. So the family did very well.
Good, good.
Yeah.
So to finish, what do you think of the service from Research Through People?
First class. Yeah, absolutely first class. Far more information than I would have expected. I also note at the end of both reports that there are suggested avenues for further exploration. And one day I may look at that. But yeah, a huge amount of information. Very grateful to have done it. My father's side, he's Scottish from Fife and so on. And those records have already been looked at, and I have a family tree for him, which I suspect is probably a lot easier doing it all in Scotland than having to look at English records and so on. So I'm grateful for that. That's been first class.
Good. Thanks for that. Always good to have satisfied customers.
Satisfied customers.
As for those who are watching, if you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe to the Research Through People channel on YouTube, as it really helps the channel grow. If you'd be interested in us looking at your family, then please get in touch. There's contact information there. I mean, John's story was fascinating. I always find it so interesting learning different things about what's happened about different people. So always very happy to do this sort of work. John, thanks very much. That was very interesting.
Yep, thank you, George. Thank you for doing the research and taking me through it tonight.